Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your patience. I think I'm sufficiently jazzed to give the presentation, having just finished a tall cappuccino with extra sugar. In fact, I think I'm going to pass on my plane ticket home, and if I had a rental car, I'd leave the keys behind and just pretty much run back to Pittsburgh. All 600 miles. I needed it, though. I needed the caffeine because I had a nice starchy lunch. After our keynote speaker this morning, I had this sudden, strange craving for pizza. I can't really explain why, but found myself eating pizza. But today's presentation, coral farming. Some of you have seen presentations that I've given in the past to other conferences or aquarium clubs on coral propagation, propagating specific animals or groups of animals. And today's presentation is going to focus more so on aspects of organized farming, the collective activity that we call coral farming. And it's going to address home-based farmers, just in your basement, in your display aquarium, doing maybe a small or a part-time business, and full-fledged full-time businesses. Going to try to cover all bases. And let me also say in advance, when you hear me using words like profit or profitable or speaking of this like a business, I don't really mean that to apply to everything, in the sense that what I'm really trying to speak to is just successful coral farming for everybody. You may want to farm corals and simply give them to friends, donate them to your local club, trade them for goods. That's still, being successful and profitable in that regard still requires some of the same aspects and address that a coral farmer for profit is going to entail. So, who coral farms? Yes, everybody that's keeping corals. The smallest display aquarium to the largest farm, a greenhouse or farm, is going to propagate corals. If you're successful, if they're alive in your aquarium and they're growing in a very short period of time, in just a matter of months, as I think most of you know, you're going to need to start pruning them, thinning them out, cutting them back. In fact, some of you, the reality is more stark than others. Like in the bottom right image, that is a beautiful tank. I think most of us would agree it's a beautiful aquarium, and yet this poor chap's got his work cut out for him. When you plant corals this close to each other, when you place corals this close to each other, they're going to have challenges, difficulties, aggression, even deaths in a matter of months for how fast many can grow if you're keeping a successful tank. So it honestly, it kind of pains me to see garden tanks like that. Although initially they make a beautiful aesthetic impression, it's unnatural and okay, maybe picking bones a bit there, but still, it has no vision or long view for what these corals need, how they could grow. We're talking about animals that have lifespans of decades, really, perhaps hundreds of years for some of them. In fact, we suspect many of these cnidarian animals have no known senescence. They have no definable lifespan, no tissue degeneration like we do, like humans do. Theoretically immortal animals. So when I visit friends and you get to visit clubs, and they're like, oh, you've got to see this tank. It's the most incredible tank. And I'm thinking to myself, if I see one more aquarium with 75 frags glued 1 inch apart from each other, I'm going to hang myself with my own belt. You really have your work cut out for you. I think most people that do that, most people that put corals just a couple inches away from each other, honestly haven't given it much thought. So I'm not criticizing folks in that regard, but if you did think about it, my goodness, they grow so quick. I mean, you're going to have to do something about it in just a matter of months. Really the best thing is to plan in advance with more natural displays. It doesn't have to be extreme. The larger image is a magnificent aquarium with a big, as you can see, a big Euphilia in there that is, I think it's 14.5 years old, if I recall correctly, and it's been through several tanks as it grows. The tank is roughly 5 feet long. That is one big coral that came in like any other hammer coral that we all get, grapefruit size, small melon size, and it's gotten to be quite enormous. And I think it's so impressive to see displays like that where someone has a monospecific stand, or even just, a more natural biotope where instead of having, 20 corals and 20 different species, you have, 3 different species, maybe 20 fragments or 20 colonies, but, less variety, a more natural, display. Oftentimes it's more successful. It's less challenging, less difficult than the toxic soup that garden reef displays entail. And if you like garden reef displays, then just acknowledge, admit, and address the challenges that you're going to face because of it, and so be it. That's how it goes. Now, beyond the desire and need to simply thin your tank or prune back, beyond your desire to trade or sell corals, there are other reasons, of course, to farm corals, and not the least of which, perhaps the most noble reason, is so that we have a self-sustaining hobby. You've heard the phrase over and over. It's not a newsflash, and yet I'm concerned as a pet hobbyist, as someone that's kept snakes and birds and lizards, and I think probably like many of you, kept all kinds of different animals for many years, 15 years right now for me, actually breeding animals. I've seen other industries, other pet industries like the bird industry and like the reptile industry, take serious, crippling hits to their hobby because their commonwealth of participants, the hobbyists themselves or the enthusiasts, heard the same warnings and admonitions that we have heard, legislative threats year after year after year. After a while, you just get numb to it. You think, yeah, it'll probably happen, but is it 10 years down the road? Is it 5 years? Is it 15 years? Sort of apathy, kind of washes over us. And when it hit the bird industry, I've used this analogy before, my apologies to folks that have heard this one, but the bird industry was probably the most extreme example. When they closed the door on wild collections, the collective hobby of bird enthusiasts just weren't prepared. There was such a plentiful and inexpensive stream of wild birds that was coming into the country that the enthusiasts didn't have a pool, didn't have a good reserve of brood stock, so that when the door shut, they were better prepared and better able to supply themselves. And a hyacinth macaw in the 70s was going for a few $100s, $300 or $400, and the day after legislation kicked in, they were over $40,000 a bird. It was extraordinary. And in fact, it took over 10 years before they even got down to near $10,000. Now they're actually affordable. They're only $3 or $4 grand. But point being, the bird, it wasn't the only bird where that happened to. And the reptile folks have faced some of the same challenges where their entire hobby and trade is dependent on wild livestock. We can't do that. We can't continue to depend on wild livestock. And one of the unfortunate things about our cottage industry of coral propagation, to those of us that are intermediate and advanced and active and aggressive about pursuing information, learning more information, participating on message boards, it seems, I think to a lot of us that, there's a lot of coral farming going on. There's a lot of fragging going on. Yeah, to some extent that is true. But we're very poorly organized. It truly is a cottage industry. Folks are working out of their basements. And for those that are somewhat more organized with larger projects or larger operations, they're still only participating in a regional capacity. The few folks that you see advertising and selling product nationally are, for lack of a better word, chop shops. You've heard the term before. It's a little abrasive to hear, and I mean that with no disrespect. It's not entirely a bad thing. When you import a wild colony of coral and you break it into 20 pieces, you find 20 people that are willing to have 20 smaller specimens and let them grow out. That's great. I mean, it really is it's a great thing. You've displaced the demand for 19 other wild corals. The problem with it is, if that is the only way that we participate as, farmers or fraggers, our livelihood, for those that are merchants, those that actually sell these animals, and hobbyists, folks that just want to enjoy these creatures and buy new ones and set up more tanks, we are completely at the mercy of so many other variables. We're at the mercy of the airline industry. We're at the mercy of legislation that could be passed. This happened just 2 years ago. Some of the radicals were trying to pass legislation so strictly controlling the transport of live animals that it would have effectively killed our hobby. Doesn't matter how legal they are to collect in the South Pacific, if you can't lawfully move them into and between the states, the hobby dies. And then there's, of course, just things like natural disasters, unstable economies. Sri Lanka is on, Sri Lanka is off, Sri Lanka is on, Sri Lanka is off, as far as getting product from all these different regions. It would just be nice if we didn't have to rely on anybody and just farmed our own stuff inside, inside the borders. So that is probably the best reason for farming corals. And again, you don't have to want to make money to be able to participate. You'll be donating, trading, giving away your pieces to friends, fellow aquarists, local clubs, local merchants that you're friendly with, whatever. But every piece that you share is one less one that will be demanded, from somewhere in the wild. So there's a good feel-good factor too. Okay. So yeah, so when you're farming corals, what are you doing with them? I think I've pretty much covered those, except that last one. There are alternatives besides trading and selling. There's other industries altogether. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard about this stuff. Folks like the cosmetic industry, biotech, the medical folks that are using sclerotinia, still using stony corals for bone grafts, extracting various toxins from zoanthids and other cnidarian animals. Really, so many interesting possible uses for corals. And for those of you that are interested in for-profit endeavors, it is by far the most lucrative. As Bob mentioned earlier, we were talking about selling food fishes for 9 cents a pound versus ornamentals for $2, $9, $20 a pound, crazy numbers. The contrast between what folks will pay in the ornamental industry for corals and what the biotech and the medical folks will pay is extraordinary. So it is venture capitalism, it is risky, it's entrepreneurial, but there could be some mad cash to be made there. So there are options, consider your options. Man, I'm in trouble. These slight movements here, I hear a little feedback on the mic, talk with my hands. If I have to keep my hands down, I'm gonna die. Okay. When I visit clubs or chat with folks by email that are interested in doing some sort of project, some sort of coral farming, inevitably one of the first questions that they ask, and a very logical question is, is there room in the market for me? Is it flooded yet? And there are so many different ways that we could approach the question that really, it is a grain of sand in a desert. It's a drop of water in the ocean. We are not even close to denting the demand for corals with our cultured products. Unfortunately, it's hard to quantitatively say, how much are we supplying? We've got the CITES Convention monitoring, tracking, at least in the case of the stony corals, these animals, and most of you know that have done any sort of reading, research, or listening at all about CITES, it's flawed. It is a very flawed process. And yet, I don't mean to criticize them. I don't want their job. I don't envy them. I mean, it is an extraordinary task that they have to try and monitor and control these animals. What I can tell you is that on a scale of magnitude, the difference between what we can grow and what we're importing is many, 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 many-fold. I can promise you, if everyone in this room tomorrow starts a coral farm and starts producing 5,000 corals a year, big fist-sized pieces, still not even going to come close. I mean, I think there's room, just my opinion, but I think in the next decade, there's room for as many folks that can jump in. And then we've got, the world economy, other countries that are developing. And interestingly, for many advanced aquarists, we've always looked to some of the Europeans, particularly the Germans, for advanced reef keeping techniques and the lead on different methodologies. Still do, and they have really some fantastic strategies. But I can tell you, as far as coral farming is concerned, it's us. We're doing a great job. There isn't a whole lot of activity that I've seen outside of the States. I mean, exaggerating a bit. I mean, there is a nice smattering around the world. I've talked to folks in Ireland setting up a coral farm, Israel, Belgium, some wild places around Croatia. That was an interesting one for a coral farm. But still, I mean, these are just a handful of folks, half dozen, a dozen. Even if it was 100, the world demand for coral is extraordinary, and it's only going to grow. My friends probably get really tired of hearing me rant and rave about garden reef displays. Don't get me wrong, I've set up my share. of garden reef displays, you know, the Hail Mary mix of just every beautiful, colorful thing you could possibly put in one aquarium as close as you can together. You don't set out necessarily to do that, but we're eager, and we're enthusiastic, and we're ambitious, and we want the tank set up yesterday. So what happens is within the first year, most people fill the tank. You may feel like you're going slow. It may feel like you can't afford to buy everything you want to afford, but there are very few tanks that after a year being set up aren't pretty well stocked, if not overstocked, and that's too fast. And if you're just mixing a little of everything, it really is a challenge, you know, as opposed to, again, having more natural or biotopic groups of organisms. As far as it pertains to coral farming, whether that means, you know, growing corals in your display or actually farming and deciding on which species go in which pools, again, it's another one. You know, there's no book that says, there's no book of allelopathy that says these corals are this toxic when in these mixes. I wish the book existed. It doesn't exist. There isn't an aquarium book, you know, yet that says these species of corals need to be kept at this amount of light, you know, this many lumens or this many lux. The book doesn't exist. If it did exist, it would be moot. Some of these corals are so very adaptable. A given species will occur over a range, sometimes as much as 60 feet or more apart. So rather than focus on, you know, at least in those regards, demanding such hard data that may be unrealistic to ask for or expect, treat it like a farmer. If it walks like a duck and it squawks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And you look at your aquarium and you know when your aquarium's healthy, when things are doing well, and you can just use some good educated guesses and intuition when you've got things that really come from two different oceans, or corallimorphs collected at 60 feet of water, 70 feet of water, in an aquarium next to porites or acropores that are collected in 3 feet of water. Adaptable or not, it's a stretch. You know, it's a stretch to put two such unnatural organisms together under a standardized set of physical parameters, lighting, water flow, and such. It just seems to me that most corals, in those cases, they can't both or all be, they can't all thrive. They can't all survive and grow optimally. So it's definitely better to focus. And really, you're going to approach coral farming very different than you do a reef display in so many ways. The light you choose, the way you deliver water flow. One of my favorite examples, I mentioned chickens and bulls here, is if you want to, if you're working on a project, if that project's your home aquarium, if that project is a business, if you want to set up a hamburger stand, one of the first things you should do is look to other successful models. If I wanted to set up a hamburger stand, I'd pay attention to McDonald's. I would see what they're doing. It's what anybody would do, you know, for good business. You would mimic them. You would pick out the parts that were good and useful to you, that made sense, and you would copy them, period. That's what you do with a good, successful model. As far as farming is concerned, coral farming, look to other farmers. Tomato growers, poinsettia growers, regular agricultural farmers. There's a very good reason why farmers don't grow bulls and chickens and pumpkins all on the same acre of land. If they could do it, they would, but they don't. They're incompatible. And the situation is even more dynamic in aquarium systems and aquatic systems, because in this 3D environment, you've got other factors. You know, beyond just physical competition for space, you've got, again, noxious warfare, allelopathy, chemical aggression, other big issues at hand. So when you have these unnatural mixes of animals, they spend energy. They waste energy in defense, in combat, in activities other than growth and reproduction. So even if they survive, even if your garden reef tank is 5 years old, nothing's died, they still look great. There's no question that it was still at the expense of something more desirable, in my opinion, vigor, growth, you know, etc. So yes, do consider. Okay, try not to gloss over on this. And I promise I won't make it too dry or no fun. But especially for the folks that want to do some sort of organized farming, whether that means, you know, systematically getting 10 pieces per month out of my tank, 20 pieces per month out of my tank, 50 pieces per month, whatever, or you've got a business. Take the 15 minutes, half hour, I promise you it won't take more than an hour, to just do what they call financial needs analysis, an FNA. It's nowhere near as fancy as it sounds, if it sounds fancy at all to you. It really is a simple matter of sitting down, looking at your project, if it's your aquarium or your greenhouse or anything in between, and adding up the number of things plugged into the wall, adding up how much electricity they consume, adding up how much they cost to buy, then how much it's going to cost to operate. You'll have these fixed costs, the ongoing cost that is always there of running the lights for the same amount of hours every day, running the pumps for the same amount of hours every day, twice a year replacing X fluorescent lamps, once every year or two replacing halides, and it goes on. Add all that stuff up. Don't show your wife or husband, but add all that stuff up and put it in a safety security box in a bank that she doesn't know anything about. It'll really illuminate so much for you. It'll make you understand, of course, how much it costs to do business, how much it costs to run this aquarium. It'll also help you make goals. My goal for being a coral farmer is just to have a beautiful display tank, and I would just like it to pay for itself. I'd like to grow enough coral in this tank that when I thin them out and sell them in my local shop or go to the fag swaps, with my local aquarium club, I'd just like to break even. That's pretty cool. I think most people would agree with that. I think a lot of people would agree with that. How are you going to know how much you need to make to stay on track? So again, I don't need to take fun out of the hobby, but it's not much effort to do that sort of thing. And just briefly mentioning, for those of you that are interested in literally making like a part-time job or a full-time job out of coral farming, you need to go further. You need to do a business plan. And if you've delved into, if you've looked for advice yet on your project or on your business, and you're really seriously thinking about it, someone surely at some point has told you you've got to do a business plan. If they haven't, I'm telling you, you've got to do a business plan. Statistically, if you don't do it, you're going to fail. Statistically, if you don't do it, you're going to fail. If you do it, it's still going to be tough, to get off the ground. But my goodness, a good business plan will illuminate so much for you. I mean, it's funny. One of the things that really stands out to folks that set up a pet shop or set up a coral farm, when they come back later and go, when I ask them, what surprised you the most, or tell me about you and your business plan, so many of them have said, I had no idea I could spend so much money on PVC. When you do and even with your own aquariums, you think PVC, it's like 40 cents a fitting, which I'm going to spend, what, 20, 30 bucks in PVC? $410 later, you're like, what hit me? And for pet shops and coral farms, you're spending thousands of dollars. Those $3 valves add up, and those 50-cent elbows add up. And so you could be way off budget on your project. And I think it's pretty safe to say that most of us aren't independently wealthy. So, being off the mark by $4,000 would be a big deal. And you want to know these things in advance before you take a loan out, a mortgage, a second mortgage on your house, for this business or something serious, Even if you can't afford financially to make mistakes like that, it's just not efficient. It's just not sensible. So everybody should do a business plan if you're doing a bigger project. The aquarium on the left is Daniel Knopp's aquarium, 1,500 gallon, really nifty. Let's see here. Okay, much of this I've already run through, but okay, you've agreed to make an FNA. You're going to take your half hour, 45 minutes to do it. Oh, by the way, if you're going to do a business plan, there's really some great software for it. Business Plan Pro and 20 others like it. In our information age, what is the prize? You can go buy a CD or a DVD, and it will just walk you through click, 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 click. I'm not making, I don't mean to sweet code it. It's no fun to do a business plan. It's dry and it's boring, and you will spend weeks. You might spend months writing a business plan for even a small business. When you're done, it's going to be 30 or 40 pages long. Might be 60. It's something you're going to carry to a bank to get a loan. They won't look at you if you don't. No self-respecting bank would. So again, I don't mean to sweet code it, but there's a lot of information you're going to need to hash out. And yeah, try some of that software. It makes it pretty friendly. So while you're making your plan, okay, start to establish your goals. Now, what is my purpose here? Am I trying to generate product for trade? Am I trying to generate product for profit? How much profit do I want to make? Cover my expenses, make a little money, make crazy money. Figure it out. Think about it. One of the things that we underestimate the most is our own personal time. We all think we have more time than we really do. It takes a lot of time to farm corals. Farming is farming. Doesn't matter if you're in a field doing corn or if you're in your greenhouse with your corals. You will spend many, many, many hours sweating over an aquarium, lifting buckets of water, shoveling sand, hoisting rock. It's real work, and it takes time. And if you've got other hobbies, other interests, especially family, children, spouses. it's going to cut into time. It'd be great if they could participate with you. And if they can't, then you need to be respectful of it, mindful of it, and plan for it. And then species selection, I could probably rant way too long on that, but it does just getting back to being conservative and not being too ambitious. It's like a haircut. If you get a haircut and they take off too much hair, it's harder to put hair back on. If they just trim off a little and you don't like it, they can trim some more off. With species selection, if you start really low in the variety and the diversity that you have and you decide, you know what, I can't handle more, it's not a big deal, to add another species or two to your project, your program, your pool, your aquarium. But if you put too many in, it's harder to erase. Really bad things happen to everybody, in the system. So again, be conservative. For folks that I talk to that are already in the game, it amazes me how many people really don't have a grasp of their potential from their broodstock. They can tell you they have 7 different species of zenith. They can tell you I've got this many aquariums, I've got this many gallons of water. But when you ask them what's the low end and the high end of your production, 3,000 a month. No. How many animals do you produce? And from which colonies? How big is your broodstock? How many Xenia elongata do you have? And then how many can it yield? These are very, very real numbers that are easy to come by and critical to have. For you to meet your goals, again, breaking even, making a little bit of money, making mad money, you need to know how many animals it's going to take to reach those goals. And you need to figure out, okay, I need 3,000 Xenia elongata that yield minimum 50 a week, sold for $6 a piece to a distributor to make my financial goal. It's not rocket surgery. I can go for an egg all of a sudden. Am I the only one that saw that commercial? Okay. But yeah, it's not rocket science. With these animals, it's simple math that most people overlook and neglect to do. But it is very, very important. Another one like time, like personal time, your space. You would just want to do too much. We're ambitious, we're excited, we have big dreams, and that's all beautiful. I don't want to ruin that at all. But again, be very realistic about the space you have. It's much easier to add on when you have extra space laying around than to not do it. The caveat to that, I suppose, is the second line down, the mention of the cost of not growing corals. And that encompasses a few things. In your display aquariums, having animals that just simply aren't growing well or at all. If you need them to produce, if you need them to be cash positive, and they're not, they're out of there. If you need to make your financial goals, you've got to address that. You need to find something else in your program, in your aquarium, in your greenhouse, your business or whatever, that can make up for them, that can make enough money to carry them, or they need to be cut out, period. It's that simple. And having, especially for pet shops, this is an enormous peeve of mine, and it's always been this way. Even just as Joe Consumer, so many years ago, to go into a pet shop and see a display with animals that are not for sale, especially if they are extraordinary specimens that the pet store could never ever get again. Now, if you're a pet shop owner, you're probably an aquarist. Very few pet shop owners start as business people, or aquarists that have ended up being business people. And it's not a crime at all to see all those beautiful animals coming in every single week and cherry picking them, stuff that you'd like to keep and continue to see and enjoy and photograph and own. Nothing wrong with that at all. But don't display it. Don't put it on the floor in front of your customers and tease them. Don't say that I've got the best stuff and I'm willing to sell you the second best. It sends a bad message, whether you know it or not. So my strong advice to folks that have walk-in traffic is if you're going to have animals that are not cash positive, that do not make money, don't tantalize your clients with it. Get it out. Pull it back at home, somewhere off the floor, but don't show it. Don't show it to them. And they're going to cost you money. You're going to have to carry them. Let's see. Cost of growing corals is just, what we talked about. How much do the lights run, how much they cost to operate, how much they cost to replace. Write it all down. Part of your business plan, part of your financial needs analysis. Optimal stocking densities, it's another one you have to finesse and experiment with. There's no textbook that will tell you what the optimal stocking density is. Less is always better, but it's not. Well, less is always better for the animals in terms of animal husbandry, but it's not always better for profitability. To achieve optimal profitability, you need to find the balance. As many corals as I can keep in here as possible that survive and thrive and help me meet my goals with a program of husbandry, demands on my time for maintenance that I can handle, that I like. Some people are willing to do daily maintenance. Some people only want to do weekly maintenance. Some people don't want to do any maintenance at all, and they want to pay people. And then the competency of your staff is, an issue as far as how much you can stock and how densely you can keep them. So I apologize, it's getting kind of dry for Aquarius, for us regular hobbyists, but a brief mention for the merchants. And then cycles of harvest. Getting back to knowing your brood stock, knowing how many, how big my leather coral is. I've got this one big leather coral on my display, and I think I need to cut it twice a year to keep it the size I want to keep it. I don't want it too close to the overflow. I don't want it too close to this coral because it's burning it, or the tunic, the mucus tunic that it sloughs is really noxious and it just burns tissue when it drapes over, the encrusting gorgonian, whatever. The cycle of harvest is just that. How long is the term that you need to obey for controlling growth of display organisms or harvesting farmed animals? The cycle of harvest for Xenia is pretty quick, and the cycle of harvest for Recordia is pretty slow. In fact, so slow that it's arguably not profitable for most folks. But yeah, it's another one you want to do the math on and look at the big picture and see how it all fits into your goals. Okay, you've got all the husbandry and the hands-on stuff out of the way. You've dotted your I's, you've crossed your T's, you've made your plan, your tank is growing really well, your farm is growing really well. Now what do I do with this stuff? Getting in the loop is probably one of the hardest things for aquarists to do because we are just that. We are aquarists participating in a cottage industry. We're not business people. Most of us do not have business training. So it's like, how do I get hooked up? How do I get in the loop? And it's really not so hard. One of the first things I would recommend that you do is subscribe to the trade journals. It's one of the best places for information. That is why they exist. If you're going to participate in the trade, subscribe to the trade journals. Pet Business, Pet Age, Pet Supplies Marketing. If you're forgetting these things or you want more advice, just email me later. Don't worry about it. I'll send you more information and links to these places. But the subscriptions are $20, $30. Some of them are kind of expensive, over $100 for these subscriptions, but money well spent. In these trade journals, you get articles that tell you about how to give you a pulse on the industry, trends in sales, trends in consumer buying preferences. For example, how much of the aquarium market is saltwater? I think Bob mentioned this earlier too. In fact, I just recently saw the statistics, new statistics for last year. But yeah, it's the same thing every year. The freshwater hobby is about 90%, about 89–90% of the aquarium hobby. The remaining 10% or so of marines are mostly fish keeping. Reef invertebrates are a very small part of the marine hobby, which is a very small part of the total aquarium hobby. And the dedicated, hardcore SPS, reef keepers, like a lot of you guys, like a lot of us, are just a fraction of a percent. I'm going to mention this later, so keep that in mind. But as far as getting into the loop, you get those subscriptions to those magazines, you get all that information, you get the addresses and the phone numbers for distributors, people to sell you plastic bags, people to sell you styrofoam boxes, people for you to sell your corals to. Annual indices of manufacturers, distributors, retailers. It's priceless stuff. So yeah, go get some magazines, get some subscriptions, and really network. Hit up all the trade shows and the conferences that you can. I've been doing this over 10 years now. It's just an enthusiastic hobbyist that I go to really a lot of conferences each year. When I wasn't doing article and book stuff, I was still going to a good half dozen a year of the national conferences and a bunch of regional and local ones, of course. And really, those folks, those of you that have read and maybe remembered part of the introduction for my Coral Prop book, I mentioned that. I wrote that book by just a decade worth of going to these shows and taking notes, and one day just forming them into more or less what ended up being the book of coral propagation. Anybody can do that. Anybody can sit there faithfully, month after month after month and take notes at these various conferences and end up with some incredible information. So network, squirrel that stuff away. In the States, we have the backer shows, which are very generalized, pet-type shows. Really not that exciting as far as product displays, but the people that go to those shows are the gems. They're the treasures there. It's sitting at lunch and breakfast and dinner, at the bar later, whatever activities these conference folks may have planned, and socializing with the owners of these other businesses. Your competitors, who are generally in the aquarium industry, generally very friendly, especially when you're not that close to each other, if you're not really working in the same market, the same state, the same plane, internet versus bricks businesses, things like that. A lot of these guys are really friendly and generous with their information. They're going to pick your brain, and they're going to let you pick theirs. I don't remember ever going to a conference where I spent a few $100s in transportation and food and various expenses, and not come back feeling like I got some bit of information that made it all worth it. So do consider, and I'll give you some suggestions if you want, specific to your interest. If you want to email me, let me know what your business is like, and then I'll maybe suggest what are the better shows, because you can't afford time or money-wise to go to them all. But you've got Interzoo in Germany every 2 years, which is the global trade show for more or less dry goods. You've got Aquarama on alternating years for livestock. Nationally, you've got Super Zoo in Vegas. The backer shows we got here in Chicago, and then over on the East Coast in Atlantic City. Tons of shows in Florida, tons of shows in California. The list goes on. So you got your plan, you got a good idea where you're going, you're starting to network. Now let's figure out, okay, what specifically is my market? What can I produce? What level of a player am I? I think most folks are definitely going to start local. You should start local. Start small. It is much better to start small and be able to satisfy every customer's demand, request for your product that you can, and not turn anybody down, as opposed to having big dreams and having your 20 corals turn into 200 or even 2,000, jumping past the locals and the regional folks and going straight to California and hitting up the 10 biggest wholesalers and saying, I can supply you with whatever you need, and then having your biggest dreams come true. Every one of them places an order. You'd be amazed. Even if just 1 or 2 of them come through and say, you know what, I'll take 200 a week. And suddenly you need to produce 800 to 1,000 pieces a month. If you can't do it, not only have you disappointed that person, but those guys network. They go to the shows and the conferences. They talk about us. We talk about each other. They talk about the yahoos and the amateurs, and they talk about the good guys, the reputable ones. You should hook up with Charlie. He's a great guy. He does this, he does that. Don't give yourself a bad reputation from go. Start small, grow big, keep people happy along the way. Local would be, giving stuff away. You don't care to make money. You just want it to go to a good home, and you like the notion that it's going to displace the demand for a wild coral. You find aquarists online through your pet shop and your local aquarium club that you can just give product to, so you're not throwing it away. Trading at the frag swaps, what a wonderful outlet and avenue, for cultured corals. Nowadays they're strong and they're getting stronger, and it's a wonderful venue for you to trade and sell. I'm sure some of you probably made some mad cash in some of these frag swaps. It's amazing. If you haven't experienced it yet, besides being a great social gathering, you'll see guys that'll go to these frag swaps with a dozen little bags of frags, and come home with $600, $800. It's pretty impressive. And they happen quarterly, sometimes more often, within your region. I think if you live anywhere near a big city, you could probably find a frag swap within a 3, 4, or 5 hours driving distance quarterly without any trouble at all. I'd be surprised if you couldn't. So it's a nice way to make some money, a couple $1,000s a year from frag swaps to help you pay for the electricity to run your lights, and whatever other expenses you might have. It's a beautiful thing. First of all, you need to find a shoehorn. Now, you know what, as far as it pertains to coral farming, it's interesting, because one of the folks that come up to me and say, I just started this business, and they're all excited, and they're telling me about this new business that they're doing, and I swear, out of 100 people, 90 of them are going to be like, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to grow SPS corals, zoanthids, and resell clams, and I'm going to retire by selling them on the internet. Like, no one's thought of this. I'm like, okay, let's back up a bit. You're going to jump into the most competitive aspect of the market. Of all the coral fragging and farming that's currently being done, it's pretty much SPS corals. It is the most competitive aspect of coral farming, done by fellow aquarists. And it is also the absolute tiniest part of the market. So you want to stake your livelihood, your goals, your ambitions, your dreams, your profit, your dreams for profits on the tiniest part of the market and the most competitive part. No, don't do that. Look at the successful business models. The industry, our industry, like most any other, is driven by beginners, period. If you're into stereos, if you're into various consumer electronics, consumers, cameras, fish keeping, beginners buy the overwhelming majority of that product. If you want to make money, you got to sell to the beginners. When you go to the national distributors and you say, I'm a coral farmer, here's what I grow, your heart's going to be broken when they couldn't give two flips about these bizarre little zoanthids that you have and this incredible selection of SPS corals. Why? Because they can't sell it. They're not there to like you. They're not there to love you. They're not there to help get other aquarists excited. They're there to make money. And the people that they sell their corals to are pet shops that would also like to make money. It's not a charity. And so beginners demand the majority of the products, and you have to obey that. So you need to grow hardy, colorful, cheap, soft corals mostly. If we could grow LPS corals, there'd be a market for them with the beginners, but as most of you know, it's just right now not feasible and really may never be because of how slow they grow and how difficult they are to produce in numbers. But my strong advice, if you want to make money, is don't do SPS corals and don't do zoanthids. Do cheap, colorful mushrooms. If you can grow your zoanthids fast enough, actually they are profitable, but most people can't grow them quick enough. Leather corals, common finger leathers, common mushroom leathers. If you look at good old Dick Perrin, for 20-some years, he's always maintained a couple big pools, 2,000-gallon pools there, of nothing but dirt brown leather corals. And I respect him for it. It makes money, period. It pays bills, and it allows him to keep other aquariums of less profitable, interesting organisms that get bought, sold, and traded with advanced folks like us. And there's some good money to be made, but it's not in volume. To make money, you got to do the volume. So, yeah. Systems and hardware. All those really cool toys that we like to play with on our display aquariums. Remember that slide or I guess at the beginning of the show that said display aquariums and coral farming are two very different things? They really are. And you can, I'm delighted to say, you can forget about those expensive skimmers. You can forget about all the expensive toys that you've got in your display tanks. They're not necessarily, they're not needed necessarily, and they're not welcome in a coral farming endeavor. They're too expensive to purchase, they're too expensive to operate, and because of the water change, the sheer volume of water change you'll be doing, so many of these aspects are minimized, reduced, or eliminated. The skimmers. Yeah, you've got this incredibly sexy, acrylic monster that's got 2, 3, 4 water pumps operating it. Costs you $1,000 to buy it, costs $20 a month to run, and gives you better skimmate than any other skimmer. Great. What you could have bought, or you could have built a PVC Nielsen-style skimmer, an old-fashioned countercurrent skimmer, albeit a pain in the butt, making daily adjustments. Then again, you're a coral farmer, so you're doing something daily, with your tank or your pools anyway, feeding, dosing, calcwaser, doing water changes, fragging, cutting, making a little tweak on a gate valve shouldn't be any skin on your nose. And so you can have a skimmer that produces 90% as good as your $1,000 monster for 10% of the cost. That's value, and that's what coral farmers do. So you don't need those big old sexy skimmers. That, by the way, is my friend Adam says now is our friend from Wet Web Media, working with Bob and I on Wet Web Media. He's also the co-editor with our friend Scott Fellman, who some of you have been drinking heavily with this weekend. Co-editors of the new electronic magazine, Conscientious Aquarist. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. Okay, there's the plug. And that is not the biggest skimmer that we saw at Interzoo. It's not even close to the biggest skimmer that we saw in Interzoo. There was a Sanders model skimmer that you literally could have swam in. It was extraordinary. By the way, top center, I'm guessing many of you haven't seen these yet, but there's a really neat little UV sterilizers that are halogens. They need extremely high water flow, and they are really tiny. They're literally like cantaloupe-sized, pretty nifty, and they can run on huge systems. By the way, I'm sorry, Phyto, I'm not saying that you don't need Phyto. I'll talk more about feeding here in just a bit. But I guess the point of the previous slide was, the expensive hardware has no place in coral farming. You need to minimize the use of electricity in general, reduce the amount of lights that you're using, reduce the amount of pumps that you're using, not only to save money on the operating expenses, but you know what happens if you've got a beautiful coral farm and you've got 20 tanks and each tank has 4 power heads in each one, and you bought 6 cases of power heads to start your business? You know what's going to happen at the end of 5 years? Not only are a good number of those power heads not going to be working, but you will have electrocuted yourself no less than 17 times in that process. There are many reasons why it's not sensible to use tiny, small, water-moving devices. They're not good values. You want to try and optimize larger, more efficient, heavy-duty water-moving devices. The tall left image. It's something that a lot of us can do with our display tanks. You've got a return pump coming off your sump that instead of just blasting right into the display aquarium or trying to tee it or doing something cute with it there, you can harness perhaps some surge devices, dump buckets, that sort of thing. That's a really nifty aquarium actually in the Bay Area. I think they advertise heavily on a couple of the big, on Reef Central, maybe a couple of the big message boards, but a Tropical Paradise in San Leandro. It's actually one of the nicest pet stores I've ever seen. From the perspective of an advanced aquarist. It's not the sexiest, it's not pretty carpeting, it doesn't necessarily smell great, but it is neat in terms of species selection, the owner, the staff, they're just hardcore people. So if you're a hardcore aquarist, it's your type of store. Other things you can do for water flow is, bottom right is corals in suspension. Some aquarists have been playing with that more and more as these years have been going by. There's some great threads on the big message boards where they've shown images of it. It's just a way to maximize the water flow that's being produced in the tank. No matter how many corals you have, in your pool, in your display or your coral farming pool, it's going to cost you the same amount of money to produce X water flow, or however you've chosen to deliver it. Wouldn't it be great if instead of having a tray with 20 corals on it, you've got a tray with 20 corals and you've got another 20 above it, all using the same water flow? It's nothing brilliant, it's not rocket science, but it's easy to overlook or forget, and little things like that you can do to really make your system efficient. Upper right is a little raceway culture for frags. Say if you had 20 frags that each needed, again, gross generalization, but say if you had 20 frags that each needed 400 gallons per hour to grow optimally. What a kind of a ridiculous example here, but still. Instead of having X number of outlets directed at all those different corals in your display or in your pool, what if you had a raceway that had just one outlet producing 400 gallons per hour, maybe 500 or 600 compensating, and just forcing through that tight channel where all those corals are lined up, all taking advantage of that limited amount of water flow. It's just being efficient, So get creative. All kinds of things you can do. There are species in your display tank and in your farming pools that are just not going to survive no matter what you do, trying to cheap out on water flow. The picture in the center is actually Acrophora cervicornis. Some of these dynamic, some of these corals from very dynamic parts of the reef need so much water flow that it would take the tissue off of other corals if you were providing enough. And you're just not going to cheap out on them. But then again, they're not profitable. You're not going to have them in your system. Let's see. Hair lies, and if you don't, smash your tank with a sledgehammer. And I'm like, no, you don't have to do that. You can start smaller. They get caught up. And as far as calcium and alkalinity, you'll hear things like 500 parts per million of calcium, DKH of 14, 16, 18. That is insane. That's absolutely insane. Even if you've got a tank that's dominated by stony corals that are growing fast, it's rare that an aquarist will have a need for calcium that is so high that you've got to sit at such precarious levels of water chemistry. To put this in perspective, your tank, if you have any doubts about it, test your daily demand for calcium. If you can afford to do it, if it's not a tank, if your tank isn't overstocked, test your calcium. Don't add calcium for 2 or 3 days. Test it at the end, divide by the number of days. It's a little easier that way because the small numbers are tougher to read on our hobby-type test kits. So go for a longer spell, get a bigger difference, and you'll get a better idea of what my daily demand for calcium is. In your tank, that might be 20 parts per million. It might be 50 parts per million. If it was extraordinary, if it was 80 parts per million, that's still only 80 of 450. Being at 500, being at 450 is too high. In my opinion, it's too high if you're pushing the envelope on all these parameters. It is inconvenient, it is unnatural, it is at least I'm sorry, I shouldn't say unnatural, but it's inconvenient and it's unnecessary to be at the high end of all ranges, particularly alkalinity and calcium at the same time. You will find, many of you have noticed, that if your calcium gets kind of high, if you're sailing nicely past 400, you'll notice that your alkalinity tends to stay flat. That's okay. If it's consistent, you'll have much better growth, much better success. I assure you. If you have 2 tanks, one tank that has 350 ppm of calcium and 8 or 9 DKH, still within the safe range. The safe range, by the way, in my opinion, 8 to 12 DKH for alkalinity, and 350 to 420 or so on calcium. 325 is not terrible. But if you've got a tank that has very stable calcium at, say, 350, and very stable alkalinity at just 8 or 9, and keep the same amount of corals, put that tank up against another aquarium with the same species that is stretched and pushed and spiked to the high end of the ranges, the tank with the lower readings I think will oftentimes grow better because it's consistent, because it's stable. And in turn, if you have 2 tanks with the same readings, they both have 400 ppm of calcium, they both have 10 DKH, the tank A gets those readings by very small daily doses. You go from down to 390, and you add, the next day, and you get up to 410. Down to 390, up to 410. A nice, real even dosing schedule. And you got in the other tank, your average 400 parts per million of calcium you got by dosing weekly, and you drop down to 300, and you rip it up to 500. And then a week later, you drop down to 300, and then a week later, you rip it up to 500. Again, it's not rocket science. Consistency of any level of these biominerals, even lower ones, will deliver better, faster, stronger coral growth. And 2, you guys know too, that fast calcification isn't always a good thing. It develops weak skeletons, just like eggshells and other things. So no, don't get caught up in the whole hype. It's not that big of a deal. Feeding, personalities, aquarists, other speakers and writers like our friend Dr. Ron have been preaching for years about the need to feed a lot more than we have been. I couldn't agree anymore. We have grossly underfed our aquariums for a very long time. And I think we're finally starting to get a better appreciation for it. There are challenges to water quality, for sure, with feeding well or feeding heavily. But, this is part of the game. Starved tanks don't grow fast corals. And if you're a farmer, you're going to need to feed more than usual and do larger water changes than usual, probably skim harder than usual. It's just part of the game. Some of you have heard me rant before about the excessive use of phytoplankton, and it's really not fair for me to say probably excessive use of phytoplankton. I think what I regret is that the popular delivery, promotion, use of zooplankton, which is, yes, it's harder to make. You can't just bottle a bunch of mysids, live mysids, and stick them on an aquarium shelf and have them sit there for 4 months waiting for someone to buy them. Whereas you can do it with phyto. Yeah, it's harder to do it with zooplankton. I would just like to remind everybody that most of the cnidarian animals that we keep, most of the filter feeders that we keep, and certainly most of the corals specifically that we keep, they're carnivores. They want zooplankton. They want microcrustaceans. And yes, you need some phytoplankton to feed some microcrustaceans, like copepods. But the mysids don't. The amphipods don't. They carrion. They detritus and just matter other than phytoplankton, than single-celled algae and greens. So don't abandon your phyto. It's good stuff. But embrace many other foods too. Bottom left and bottom right images are 2 terrible pictures. Terrible because I took them. Of some popular macroalgae that you would use in refugiums. Refugiums are, man, Bob mentioned earlier, and I couldn't agree anymore. It's going to be like skimmers. At some point in time, they're going to be as indispensable in aquarium keeping as skimmers are. I can't think of a disadvantage, and there are so many different interpretations of refugiums. Refugiums as vegetable filters, bog-type filters, exporting nutrients by growing and then harvesting them. Refugiums without macroalgae, even unlit, with various types of media, various types of matrices that you encourage different types of macroorganisms, different types of worms, different types of zooplankton, there's amphipods, copepods, the whole 9 yards. There's just so many different ways to make so many different refugiums, and they are priceless. better than any prepared food that we could package or sell, I hate to say. Even if I was selling packaged foods, I think I would say that. But there is so much variety to be had, and there are very few corals that are fully autotrophic. In fact, I don't know that I could name one. There are a few that we think are mostly autotrophic. They can be sustained fully by the products of photosynthesis and just being illuminated. But it's very, very, very rare. I mean, the vast majority of corals need to be fed. And if you don't feed them, they won't grow. If they don't grow, you don't make no money. And if you're not concerned about making money, they just won't survive. You know, if you're missing their daily demand, their need for food by 1% per day, that's still starvation. It just might take 3 years for it to finally starve to death. It might take a year and a half. Feed them well, and deal with the excess through good, aggressive nutrient export mechanisms. Your water changes, your skimmer, the whole 9 yards. If you've read anything I've ever written about natural filtration, as you know, I'm a big fan of deep sand beds. And because I'm overrun for time just a bit here, I'm not going to get too in-depth here, and I think we're almost at the end of the presentation, but I won't get too far in-depth about deep sand beds, but I am a big proponent of using deep sand beds. And I just wish, as Bobby mentioned earlier too, that so many aquarists have only been in the hobby a year or 2 or 3. At conferences like this, we have more people that have been in longer, but you're the exception by far. What happens is, newer aquarists don't have the history and the perspective of the hobby that those of us that have been around for a while have. And it's just frustrating to see how people go from the Berlin method, you know, in the 80s. It's the best thing since sliced bread. Everyone does Berlin, bare bottom tank. And then 3 years later, Berlin method is Satan incarnate. What we need to do is put 1 inch of coarse media on the bottom. And then for a year or 2 or 3, everybody is, you know, peeing on the Berlin method and, you know, espousing the 1 inch sand bed, or the 1 inch sand bed. And then all of a sudden, deep sand beds. We need a deep sand bed. All the other stuff we told you before, that's all crap. What we need to do, deep sand beds, okay? And then 2, 3 years go by. Some people have some problems with these aquariums. A lot of people have problems with their aquariums for so many other reasons. Lack of quarantine, overfeeding, overstocking, the common things that get new aquarists out of the hobby so darn quick, and they look for an excuse. And the excuse is now deep sand beds. Let's go back to the Berlin method. Everyone back to Berlin, you know, bare bottom. It's just like, read the history books, guys. Look, just pay attention, you know. There are reasons for this. So my quick take on deep sand beds, if you just take the time to be objective, stand back and look at the extraordinary amount, the extraordinary number of zoological institutions, the other coral farms that are out there, find me a coral farm that doesn't use deep sand beds. Dick Perrin's been using huge deep sand beds for 20 plus years. The deep sand beds in my systems were the same. I have sand beds right now that are uninterrupted for almost 10 years now. The key, I'll tell you what I think the key is. The key is good, strong water flow, which most of us are woefully deficient in. If you have a normal tank, forget overstocking, forget overfeeding like so many people do. If you have a normal tank that accumulates, feces, detritus and stuff, and you have a deficiency in water flow, and your skimmer doesn't work quite as good as it could, really. How many people actually get 2, 3, 4 cups of dark skimmate a week out of their tank? You can get it daily. When you're a coral farmer and you've been in the game for a while and you've been playing with your skimmers and you find the sweet spot on the bat, you will see that with a good skimmer, you can actually get dark skimmate every single day out of understocked tanks, just from the gastropods rasping the diatoms in the glass, their fecal pellets going into suspension, good water flow, keeping it in suspension, then sending it out the skimmer. Most of us don't have that. Your skimmers get you a cup or 2 a week, maybe not even that much, and you're maybe overfeeding a little bit, or maybe you don't have quite enough water flow, and all these little things add up to a year or 2 or 3 down the road. Yeah, a bunch of bad things happening. But it's not the deep sand bed's fault. It's a misapplication of the strategy. There are rules to it, and I think Dr. Ron, I apologize, I actually didn't see his presentation, but I'm going to see it on Sunday. So I don't know what he talked about. But I mean, there are rules to follow. Deep sand beds can work. They are proven. Look at Dick Perrin with his, I don't know how much sand he's got in those systems. My greenhouse is nowhere near as big as Dick Perrin's, and I burned through, just to set up the greenhouse, 48,000 pounds of aragonite. Before that, I'd used a few thousand pounds prior to it, and I'd used a few tens of thousands of pounds after it. And these are in systems that are 3, 5, 7 years old for me, now approaching 10 years old. They are tried and true. You just have to play by the rules like most things. Quarantine. Again, I know many of you have probably heard me rant on this before, and I will just gloss over this, but every single thing that you bring into your house, your aquarium, your coral farm, everything wet. This is it. It's all you need to know. Everything wet. Algae, snails, fish, coral, rock, sand, everything. Everything wet goes through quarantine, 4 weeks. The academics, the zoological folks have this strict rule of animal husbandry. Most farmers do too. There's a reason for it. Obey it. When someone tells me, oh man, so-and-so gave me, ACL flatworms, gave me rust brown planaria, so-and-so gave me monopolar eating nudibranchs, so-and-so contaminated my tank with blah, blah. No, and no. They didn't give it to you. You gave it to yourself. You didn't quarantine the animal, and you're going to pay for it. And beyond diseases, pests and predators, there's even just the simple fact that so many of these organisms, particularly the macroorganisms, creeping starfish, especially the asteroids, chocolate chip stars, blue Lynxia stars, the fishes themselves. There is just, let's say you could ensure that it was disease-free. You can't, but let's say that you could. Let's say the diseases weren't a concern, little bits of nuisance algae coming in weren't a concern. You still have the issue of just simply giving the animal a chance to acclimate in a comfortable, quiet environment without the competition of established organisms in the tank that have already they already know the game, as opposed to this new guy that has to hit the ground running. You could save yourself a lot of grief, like those starfish. I don't care how good that starfish looks. More than a few folks have had the experience of putting it in their tank without quarantine. It doesn't make the acclimation. 2 days later, it crawls into the reef and dies. That sucks. I mean, that really can seriously hurt your system and can wipe out your system, and I fear that a few of you have horror stories because of that. Had it been in quarantine, it simply would have died in quarantine. It also would have had a better chance of acclimating, too. So, quarantine, without exception, 4 weeks. I assure you, my goodness, it will spare you so much grief and aggravation. The controversy about lighting. There's no controversy. Nothing compares to natural sunlight. And for those of you that do have the privilege, the opportunity to grow corals by a window, under a skylight, in a greenhouse under the sun, once you've done it, I assure you, you will never, ever want to go back. And if you are thinking about doing a business where you want to farm coral and make any kind of profits, any kind of significant profits, short of, pocket change to pay for light bulbs and fish food and stuff, if you're doing anything organized where you want to make some kind of decent kind of money, if artificial lights and the electricity to run them are part of your program, you're not going to make any money. It's almost impossible. It's an extreme statement. I am overstating it to some extent, but man, is it expensive to buy, operate, and maintain lights. So if you want to make money, somehow, some way, find the sun. The greenhouse on the right is actually Dennis LeBrun. Those of you that are cartoon readers will recognize him as the Blondie cartoonist. He's a reef keeper, and he's also a coral farmer. And he's down there in Florida, sweating his butt off like everyone else in Florida. Let's see. Yeah. My goodness, it's not expensive at all. If you haven't looked into the cost of doing a greenhouse yet, you can get a big greenhouse. Like, the difference between a 30-foot greenhouse, a 50-foot greenhouse, and a 100-foot greenhouse is like $1,000 or $2,000. I mean, it is very little money. Now, the cost of operating a greenhouse twice the size for an extra $1,000 is a big deal if it's expensive to cool your greenhouse where you live, or expensive to heat where you live. So those are things you definitely want to plan in advance. But you can get a 1,000 square foot greenhouse fully stocked, completed, all the hardware but without livestock. So end walls, thermostats, vents, the tanks, all the equipment that you need to get the ball rolling for well under $20,000. The actual structure itself is only a couple grand, $3,000, $4,000. It is not expensive to get into the game. So do consider. As far as the construct, there's some big choices to be made. If you're sure that the structure you're building, a lean-to, atrium, freestanding greenhouse, whatever, if you're sure that it is really going to be there for the long term, regardless of if it's a coral farm or not, it's going to stay with the house, it may turn into plants if I ever get out of corals, whatever. Maybe you can make an argument for the longer lasting materials like Lexan, double insulated Lexan, tubular Lexan to glaze the greenhouse with, but it is scary expensive. We're literally talking the difference between glazing your greenhouse with flexible plastic, insulated plastic that you inflate with air, which actually is a better insulator than the expensive Lexan, and also allows more light in, but is weak, is vulnerable. You know, you change it every 2 or 3 years. Glazing a 50-foot greenhouse with double insulated plastic that you inflate, like $200, $300. Glazing it with Lexan, which has got a 30-year lifetime, about $11,000. It's something over $10,000. I mean, it's night and day. So if you're not convinced it's going to stay in that place for quite some time, it's okay to cheap out. It's okay to do the double insulated plastic. If you can ensure the security of your structure regarding vandals and children and storms and trees and whatever, then the double insulated plastic is the way to go. It lets in more light and a better kind of light than any other material. It simply is just not durable, and you have to replace it every 2 to 5 years depending on the plastic you buy. When you go to buy glazing for your greenhouse or your skylight or your sunroom or whatever, the overwhelming majority of them, essentially all that are not marketed for aquaculture, and even many that are, restrict UV. They cut out over 90% of the UV. That's bad. That's good if you're growing poinsettias or if you're sitting in your sunroom, you know, and you're reading the newspaper, you don't want to fry. But if you're growing corals, you want UV. You want to let as much in as possible and filter it as necessary over individual tanks or with shade cloths over the whole greenhouse. Or you can do different strategic things, but it's like that haircut thing. If you cut out all the UV from go, you can't put it back in. It'd be ridiculous. So you have a glazing that restricted or rejected UV and then have to put lights on that gave UV so you could maintain certain colors, certain pigments in some corals. So allow all the UV in as possible. Not only look for the maximum admission of light overall through a given glazing that you're pricing, glass, plastics, whatever, but also how much UV is let in. Airflow, grossly underestimated by most greenhouse people. Orchid growers, tomato growers, coral farmers. You need massive airflow in there for climate control. Don't let anybody talk you out of it, and most people won't. If you've got a good supplier that's selling you greenhouse supplies, they're going to tell you that you need 4 times as many fans as you think you need, and you're going to be wrong. Trust them, their advice. You need very, very strong water flow to have an even-keeled ambient temperature inside. If you have real specific questions about greenhouse applications, email me. Let's chat afterwards. I won't shut up, especially if I have a beer in my hand. Okay, and this picture here, this is actually Ocean Journey in Denver, and it illustrates that not only can I get 1 flash in my image, I'm so good, I can get 2 flashes bounce back in my face in an image. But they have a beautiful reef aquarium there. And that is it for today. Thank you for your patience. Okay, do we have questions? No questions. Oh, good. I was getting worried because, with Bob earlier, he felt bad. None of us asked him any questions like, oh, we were just sleepy. And then now, if no one asked a question, I'll be like, I just sucked. Okay. Your question, sir. That's okay. I'll make up a convincing answer anyway. Do I think they're dangerous or not? Absolutely not. No. They're... Oh, I'm sorry, you're absolutely right. The question was the red bugs that we see on some SPS corals, just in general, do I think they're bad or not? No, I don't. I've seen them in so many aquariums, and I haven't seen one example where they were actually killing a coral. Now, it's one of those situations, my interpretation, or my take on the whole matter with those red mites or those red, crustaceans that some people are getting plague proportions of, I think that like Asterina starfish, like Mithraculus crabs, so-called Mithrax crabs, green emerald crabs, sometimes you'll get situations, not necessarily bad individuals, bad specimens, but situations where in the absence of their preferred diet, which most people can supply, be it nuisance algae, in the case of the Asterina, just sediments, detritus, carrion, decaying food and such. In the absence of other food, it's opportunistic enough that gotta eat something, and they shift. I could be completely wrong. In fact, there's probably a very good chance I'm completely wrong. But that's my impression of it. You'll have these animals that are opportunistic and given to choose, like in a tank full of Valonia, yeah, Mithrax crabs just really seem to go out of their way eating the Valonia. And yet, in tanks that have a little bit of Valonia and a bunch of other species of nuisance algae in there, you'll find that those Mithrax, get kind of hungry. And they don't wait so long to find Valonia as they're creeping about the tank. They don't have the view and the vision that we do at the aquarium to know that, X scales of magnitude further down the road, there actually is some bubbles. We can see it, but they can't. They stop along the way when they're hungry and they eat something different. They're opportunistic. So I still don't think that's the case with the red bugs. I just think that they're a nuisance, like the ACO flatworms. They wax and wane, and I don't think they're going to kill anything. My advice to you would be very strong water flow. I've seen them more often. Not always the case. Some tanks with great water flow still have them. But oftentimes, if you don't have that solid 20-time turnover or more, citing, say, for example, Mike's new book, Mike Fletta's new book, that Ultimate, Aquarium book, Ultimate Aquariums that are in my backyard, Ultimate Aquariums that are within driving distance of my house. Mike's a friend. I do love him, but you've all heard the jokes about, how he excluded some of the international folks and, other aquariums. But let's see, what was I talking about? I'll sidetrack myself. Thank you. Mike did us a great service of listening to all those wonderful parameters and details of these tanks. And I think the average was something like 17 times per hour was the average, with some of those SPS-dominated tanks running up to 40 times per hour. And I will tell you from researchers, academics that I've talked to growing Atlantic acroporids, like that picture of Cervicornis, the Atlantic Cervicornis, I got from friends in Germany that have, they legally collected some acroporas down from Brazil. 40-time turnover, not enough to grow. They need even more. It's extraordinary how some of the SPS corals really need a lot of water flow. And if they don't get it, what happens is that micro layer that's around all corals, that anoxic, low oxygen layer of water that's around their bodies, gets thicker. And that causes the coral to secrete more mucus, which invites more opportunistic organisms, like perhaps these mites. We see it in other examples too, of other nuisance or pest organisms. So I would try to increase water flow. Just blast little buggers off and then skim them out. And it can literally work that way. It works that way with planaria, so-called planaria, the ACO flatworms. Other questions? Yes? Great question. The question is, living in the Northeast, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, how do we deal with the weak sunlight, high latitude, the weather and such? The way any of us will get around it, and you'll find that the easiest greenhouses to run, the easy coral farms to run, are oftentimes going to be in the northern states. Although we don't have as much sunlight as the tropics, by far, we also are not growing our corals at the same depth that these corals would occur in naturally. So, in fact, I have to use a shade cloth for 4 to 6 months a year so I don't burn corals in Pittsburgh. One of the 5 rainiest cities in the U.S., which I've often cited and mentioned. And to underscore that, I just finished building a pond outside. I was just fixing up one of my garden ponds, and concreted it, had a raised wall, and decided to tile it, put ceramic tile on the outside. All I needed was 2 days without rain to finish the tile. It took almost 4 weeks to get 2 days without rain, to the extent that at one point I had shoveled the pond. When it got real low, I couldn't pump it out with a sump pump. I had to use a snow shovel to actually shovel the water out. 3 times in 1 week, I shoveled 4 or more inches of rain out of the bottom of that pond. We get a lot of rain. We have a lot of overcast days, and you will still burn your corals because I'm growing them in 26 inches of water, 18 inches of water, 10 inches of water. If you have any doubts, get out your lux meter. If you're a farmer, you're going to have a par meter or a lux meter. And again, there's no handbook that says these species need this much lux, but you can use intuition, educated guesses. I mean, you have some idea of what will be enough light. You'll start without any shade cloth whatsoever. You'll see how the animals respond to it, and if that's in the winter, you'll probably be okay. As the summer, as the spring comes in, summer comes upon us, light is increasing. You're watching your lux readings increase. You're watching the corals get paler or look less happy. Take some notes. So it's not too bad. The key is growing them in very shallow water. At that point, you don't need to worry about necessarily what your latitude is, and it's the same way with artificial lamps. just pains me to see new aquarists get talked into high wattage halides. Just don't need them, especially when they're not necessarily going hardcore SPS, or I'm sorry, hardcore SPS that are shallow water species. So many wonderful SPS are deeper water, do fine with the fluorescents, T5s and PCs and such. So if you want to save money on lighting, whether that's in your greenhouse or in your display aquarium, one of the best tricks is just shallower tanks, lower, longer tanks. Other questions? Yes, sir.
What do you find is a good balance for a photo period of time? Your artificial lights where you can balance growth and electricity costs.
I apologize. I'm not sure I totally understand the question.
Okay, partly
for the greenhouse?
You're growing corals outside, but for most of us are growing inside. Photo period of time period that you have your lights on.
Yeah.
It seems the longer you have your lights on, perhaps the faster the corals will grow. But the more you're handling electricity.
Right.
Is there a balance there, or did you?
Yeah, and I'm sorry too. Getting back to your other question, no artificial lights in the greenhouse, by the way. I had one halide over two paired tanks, they're like 240s, so that in the wintertime, when the sun was the weakest and it was the lowest in the sky, in the path that it traveled in the sky, I did lose color on some of the prettier SPS corals. So I added a single 400-watt radium over these two 240s butted up against each other, and that's the only artificial light in the whole greenhouse. You don't need any artificial lamps at all. As far as striking a balance, yeah, I mean, I think probably at one point in time I thought the same thing too. You know, 8 hours of light is good, 9 hours must be better, 10 hours is even better still. You know, not to make fun of you either, but I mean, it seems logical, and it's certainly not the case. With corals, I mean, at some point they reach saturation, where no more illumination will yield any more products from photosynthesis. And then beyond that, if you give them even more light, you get to a point where you reach photoinhibition, where the symbiotic algae is shut down, physically shut down, and then really bad things happen at that point. So I can't give you a specific photo period. It really depends on not only the lights you're using, of course the needs of the corals that you're growing under them, but also the water clarity. If you're sloppy, lazy, neglectful about changing your carbon weekly instead of monthly, or using it at all, yikes. Please use carbon frequently, small amounts changed often, or use ozone. Maintain water clarity. You spend all this money on your greenhouse to get all this wonderful sunlight in. You spend crazy amounts of money on artificial lamps, and then if you've got yellow water, you've reduced the penetration of that light by 20%, 30%, 40%. And the best part is you're paying to do it. You're paying electricity to do it. It's just like, if I was the president of your electric company, I would just, send you Christmas cards, kiss you on the lips, something. But yeah, no, water clarity is a much bigger deal than maybe the wattage of the lamps and such. But okay, 8 to 10 hours. I'd say 8 to 10 hours is good, a pretty good ballpark for most people. Really high wattage halides and very shallow tanks, you could be as low as 6 hours. If your lights aren't bright enough, if you were just using like standard wattage fluorescence, some corals need to be tweaked. They need a burst of sunlight. They need bright enough light initially, not that you get a burst in the wild, but you get bright enough sunlight to start the ball game, to start photosynthesis. In the aquarium, you can trick some corals by actually giving them a burst of bright light initially and then backing down to lower light to carry on photosynthesis, but it won't actually start unless you goose them. And if you can't goose them with, say, crappy 40-watt, shop lights, adding 12 more crappy 40-watt shop lights, they'll still starve to death under those lights. So at that point, more is not better. But about 8 to 10. Other questions? Yes?
More temperature related than
Huh?
related. I live in Indiana, in northern Indiana, we usually have crazy winters in greenhouses. I don't know because of the fact that we now have very cold temperatures. I'm not sure.
No worries at all. You're concerned about just really being able to affordably maintain a hothouse. It's called a hothouse when you have a heated greenhouse all year round. Is that your concern, being able to maintain it?
I wasn't sure if they would just have to actually be maintained.
Yeah.
Times when they'd be cut off from sunlight, or
It's actually.
they could be maintained outside.
Yeah. No, it's very easy. I'm sorry. So the question is, can you maintain a hothouse, a coral farming greenhouse that's warm all year round, in a very cold place like Indiana, which gets severe winters? Pittsburgh, we get lake effect. not only are we cold, but we get a lot of rain in the summer and a lot of snow. Where, I mean, at some points we'll have, you know, a foot or more on the ground for several weeks without a thaw. Ice, the same thing. I mean, we get ice storms, dreadful ice storms that are destructive and damaging. The greenhouse is so hot. I mean, your coral, you know, the aquariums are heat sinks. I mean, they're holding and maintaining heat. You're heating it, you know, with a furnace, typically a natural gas heater and such. We had, I think it was, let me see, 92. In 92, the nation had some severe blizzards, and the Northeast was crushed. That was one of our worst snowfalls in decades. I forget how many feet of snow fell that, you know, that first hour, but it was an extraordinary amount of snow that we got. At no point during the blizzard of 92, at no point did I have more than 1/4 of an inch of snow on the greenhouse. It just melted and sloughed off faster than it could lay. I was amazed. I mean, I'd seen that with other lesser snowfalls. I was like, wow, that's impressive. But yeah, not even with feet of snow falling did it, you know, cause any problems. And you can buy greenhouses that are built for snow loads. Places where you have there's snow belts where, you know, you have high snow loads on greenhouses that are not heated. They've got greenhouses that are made to literally hold inches and inches of snow in cooler or cold frame greenhouses for days and weeks at a time. So engineering-wise, that's all cared for. The downside to all of this is, in exchange for having this hothouse that just sheds the snow away, it's doing it because it is losing heat like a bugger. It is a little bit expensive to heat these greenhouses. It was the most expensive fixed expense of operating the greenhouse, to the tune of, for my 50-foot greenhouse, about $400 a month for the 3 worst months of the year. Now that's a lot of money in natural gas, but that's not too many zinnia. When the cycle of harvest, seriously, when the cycle of harvest for zinnia or $5 button mushroom corals, sarcophytans, something cheap, hardy, staple that all the distributors want, when you can turn these things over in 2 weeks, when you can take 1,000 zinnia, cut them in half, I know this is not surprising anybody, and then, you know, 2 weeks later have 2,000 zinnia. My distributors are delighted. They're happy. They can't get enough. I only have a couple people I sell to. We could use 100 more, you know, coral farmers selling cheap, hardy soft corals. So it doesn't take too many soft corals. If you're not a stickler, if you're not such a purist and you want the challenge of all these exotic, crazy, rare species and you're not concerned about making money, great, I guess. But no, if you're willing to make money and sell things that are hardy and staple and popular, nah, that extra $1,000 a year in expenses that you're going to suffer that someone in North Carolina won't, no big deal. There's not that much money. Yes, sir.
Do you ever have any thoughts about the fact that the air that you're bringing into the greenhouse not being filtered, that pathogens from the outside would actually, because I know Sprung was talking about that, there are some, they're saying that like with the Calfo, that it's the reason why a lot of it's dying is because of the fact that there's mold inside our houses and stuff. Do you have filters on here?
No, it's an interesting question. In fact, I'm going to betray something bizarre about my personality. Won't surprise any of my friends. But the question was, do I filter the air coming into the greenhouse? Am I concerned about pathogens coming in? I will first say that I believe it is extremely rare. I think it is a very small concern. And yet, the bizarre thing that I will share with you is, before I built my greenhouse, I actually funded the greenhouse with a discus hatchery. When I was in, by the time I was in high school, I was a nerd. I was a complete, you know, book nerd student to begin with, and I was an aquarium nerd. And I had worked my way up from cheap little cichlids, you know, when I was 8, 9, 10 years old, to discus, you know, which at the time, you know, into the 80s were really good money. I mean, they were still hard to breed for most people, or at least not so much hard to breed, but they were just a lot of work. And most people didn't want to go through the labor of literally daily water changes or twice daily water changes to get, you know, certain species and types to reproduce or to get maximum growth from them and such. I did. I liked it. I enjoyed it. I made crazy money. I made enough money by the time I was in high school to put a 2-story addition on my mom's house, and the bottom floor was a discus hatchery. Outlets in the ceiling, drains in the floors, concrete pools for grow out. And that is what ultimately paid for the greenhouse. That's what got me off the ground to be able to afford to build the greenhouse. And one of the things that I would do before I would go into my discus hatchery, and then later in the greenhouse, although I did finally stop doing it, I wouldn't walk in there unless I showered first. Having gone to pet stores and gone to club meetings with frag shops, especially just working in the pet shops, I wouldn't walk into my hatchery unless I'd taken a shower because of the concern for airborne pathogens. It is a concern, more with fishes, more so with fishes, but it's rare. The reason I did it is not because I really believed it was a big deal. It's because I'm obsessive compulsive. I check windows, I check doors, I check locks, I count steps. I'm retarded, So I don't think you need to put filters on your air intakes and such. It would be inexpensive to do so if you felt better. Sure, I think, yeah, that'd be great. But I wouldn't put it at the top of the list. Yes?